Hey folks, Joe Moris with Answers, Heaven Speaks. It's Friday. Hey, it's Friday. Yeah, how about that? Got the weekend coming up, lots of good football on TV here in the United States. So I hope everybody will just have a really good weekend this weekend. We're going to continue on with the story. Again, this is Answers, Heaven Speaks from Facebook, but Marissa, my daughter, Marissa Morris Bolanowski, is a clairvoyant, clear channel. And so she gets to channel just like Muhammad channeled, and probably just like Peter channeled, and John channeled, and Paul channeled. They all channeled in one way, form, or fashion. They either got to see the Lord on the other side through their visions, or they dreamt, had very vivid, clear dreams. Or they did automatically. Paul did a lot of automatic writing. He heard things and he wrote as he heard them. And that's automatic writing. So what we do is we just try to bring our best. We try to bring Jesus up to date. For those of you who aren't really Christians and you don't really understand why we're pushing on Jesus here, I mean, we're not a church. We don't have a physical church anywhere. Neither Marissa nor I are pastors. We just like to tell the story of Jesus. I like to tell the story of Jesus from the Urantia Book. The Urantia Book is a channel book just like the Quran. And yes, I've been learning more and more about the Quran and Muhammad. And to be honest with you, and don't take offense at this for those of you who are Muslims or following this, because you're all very interested in Jesus. That's the Quran adores Jesus, even does a whole chapter on Mary. It's not correct, at least not according to the Bible. And then they love Jesus. They actually do, but they just don't believe in the resurrection. But there is so much more, and I'm not even halfway through the Quran yet. I'm up to like 600 verses, which I've read, but that's only up to chapter 5. And I think you have to go to, I don't know how many chapters there are. A lot of them, 100 and something. But what I'm starting to see as I get farther and farther into it, I'm seeing more and more that the duties of God are being transferred to the messenger, which is Muhammad, and how everybody's supposed to follow him. But then they start coming in with these rules, and these rules are definitely secular, and I do not believe that Gabriel gave any secular lessons to Muhammad. But I could be wrong. I could be very wrong. And at the same time, I feel sorry for the Muslims who have put their entire lives into following this man, and this man is not a good man. He's not a good man. Maybe in the very beginning, God trusted Muhammad in bringing forth a new religion for the Arabs, to bring all the Arabs together, because they had so many different religions. But then when you find out what his real life was like, and you would never live your life like that. Let me just tell you that. You would never live your life the way that Muhammad did. I think there's just so many Muslims that really don't know the history of who they're following. They may know the history of the Quran, and even then it's hard to do, because the Quran really wasn't written. The first draft of it was written by Abu Bakr, sort of like Muhammad's sort of right-hand man. I don't know if he was a scribe or not, but Abu Bakr had put the Quran up to the best of his knowledge, together about 30 years after Muhammad had died, which was 632. But there's such a difference between the first and the second half of the Quran. I'm going to get into the second half, and I know it's not going to be great. But anyway, as long as you have Jesus in your heart, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jew, if you're Jewish, you should take heart with Jesus. Yeah, you think of him as a prophet, but believe me, he's more than a prophet. He's more than a prophet. And unfortunately, you have to live with the sins of your fathers. Your fathers did to Jesus what probably Americans would do today. Or the worldly people today would probably do that to Jesus again. If he came, nobody would trust him. They'd probably put him up on another cross, to tell you the truth. Oh, it's crazy. So anyway, I'm going to continue on with the story of Jesus. He is still in the area of Jerusalem in the year AD 27, and he has already trained his apostles for about a year and a half up in Galilee. So they had already been with Jesus for quite some time. But now they're going to the show. They're going to the big time. They're leaving the little towns and hamlets of Galilee, and they've gone down to Jerusalem. They've also picked up the followers of John the Baptist and incorporated them into their group as well. And the apostles are having a little bit of a hard time joining in with the disciples of John the Baptist. John the Baptist taught something a little bit differently than Jesus. John the Baptist taught salvation and good deeds. Do good deeds and you'll find your salvation through good deeds. And Jesus says, no, you find your salvation through the Spirit. Just take on the Spirit. Become reborn. Accept the Spirit into your life and accept Jesus as our daddy. He's the one who created us. You can call him God if you want to. Michael is either God or not, but Michael created us. He's the one that created us. He, in conjunction with maybe other human beings from other places within the universe, all tinkered and created us human beings, but Michael had a hand in all of it. And now we sit on this sort of like experimental planet where evil is allowed to exist. And yes, when we're born into sin. You say, no, a baby can't have sin. There is no sin in a child. But what Jesus says is just being human is sin. Just being a human is sin. And he says to turn your life over to the Spirit. And once you do that, your life will change. Hopefully for the better. Obviously for the better. But the way to be reborn into the Spirit is by learning to do what Jesus was teaching to do. And he said, I live my life doing the will of my Father. I do the will of my Father, which means he must have some kind of intuition that he knows when to make a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn. He's got the intuition, and that's it. You've got the Spirit, you've got intuition, follow your intuition, because that's God's way. That's the Spirit's way. That's that Spirit that lives inside you is the Spirit of God, the Father, who lives in every single one of us. Every single one of us. Now, if those of you who follow the Bible, you know that there's hard feelings between Jews and Samaritans. The Jews just don't like the Samaritans, and yet the Samaritans are basically Jewish, but they have a mixture of Gentile blood within them, and the Jews just don't like that at all. And but there is a history as to why the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along. So let's learn about that story. Let's just go into that story. Because Samaritans come up later on. They come up several times in the life of Jesus after he starts his ministry. Because there are times where he praises the Samaritans and chews out his own apostles. Says, why can't you be more like them? So for more than 600 years, the Jews of Judea and later on those of Galilee also had been at enmity with the Samaritans. By the way, I'm not sure whether we're going to get Marissa on here today. I think she's doing a one-on-one session with somebody right now. So we may not get her on. I'll keep an eye out. But we will not go over an hour. Just to give you some idea on what happens with Facebook's algorithms or whatever, if we finish this in 1 second over 1 hour, this show will go out to about 12 to 15,000 people around the world. That's not a lot, considering there's billions and billions of people out there. But it'll go out in a reach to about 12 to 15,000 people. That's if I'm 1 second over an hour. If I'm 1 second under an hour, the reach is 120,000. 2 days ago, it went out to 204,000. So we're going to do our very best to keep these under an hour, just under an hour. All my old shows that you find, you can go into posts and see the different shows that we've been doing on the life of Jesus. But just about every single one of them are over an hour. And so we're going to keep those under an hour so that we can get a further reach. Marissa's only nervous that she might be at she might be channeling something very important from Jesus when all of a sudden I jump in and go, oh, time's up, got to stop. So we'll kind of see how we can plan that as we go along. But anyway, Marissa is doing a channeling session with one of her clients as I'm doing this right now. So she may not make it in today. And I don't think we're going to do the Gabriel show tomorrow. We're thinking about taking an hour and channeling only Gabriel in relation to the Quran. And they are very hesitant. They know something that we don't know. And it all has to do with Muhammad. There's something about it that doesn't click. Something isn't right. Something's just off. And so we want to talk to Gabriel and find out what it is. And he said, don't do it during a live broadcast because we can influence people one way or another, which might be negative, and we don't want to push anybody in a negative direction. And I've always said, one of the very first parables that Jesus gave us was the parable of the orchard. And what he was saying is there's lots and lots of religions in his time. He says, is there one true religion? My God, you'd think he would have thought the Jews were the number one religion, the Hebrew faith. But he just hammers them. He hammers them, calls them a bunch of vipers and hypocrites and snakes. And you just, ye gods. So what he says is, fine, we all have our religions. Everybody's got their way of finding God, finding the Father. And there is no one true fruit. If there was one true fruit, he would probably say it's Christianity. But he didn't even want a religion in his name. He didn't. He wanted his message to be delivered, much like Daniel or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Jonah or Joel or whoever else of the prophets. They didn't start their own religions. They were just mouthpieces for God. And maybe that's the way it started out with Muhammad as well. He was just supposed to be a prophet. He wasn't supposed to be on the equivalence of Jesus. There's no comparison. Absolutely no comparison. Muhammad even admits, I'm just a regular man. There's nothing magical about his birth. The only thing magical was him being able to channel. But seeing as Marissa and I don't channel. I ask the questions, but Marissa does the channeling. And we're always very careful about what comes in because something bright can come in. But Marissa can sense that, and then she can question the person or whoever it is that's in. And once we proclaim the goodness of Jesus, whoever that is, it might be of a negative nature, gone. Gone. They all respect. They may be pure evil, but they respect Jesus because Jesus is the maker of all of us. Even those bad spirits. Even Lucifer. Lucifer was created by Michael. He was put in charge. He was created to be in charge of a whole system. A system is 1,000 inhabited planets. 1,000 inhabited planets within a constellation, within one constellation. And there's 100 constellations that make up a universe. But anyway, so there's always been this conflict, and we'll get into it as we go through Jesus' life. We'll get into the Bible. We'll get into the Bible accounts as they pair up with the Urantia Book. So far, we're not paired up yet. because the Bible doesn't talk about any of Jesus's activities prior to his ministry. And then as you read the account of, let's say, Luke and his ministry, bang, it just goes right from him being in the temple at 12 years old to being out there with all his apostles and healing people. So everything that led up from the age of 12 up until then, the authors of the New Testament just didn't write about. The Urantia Book gives us that account. So anyway, nobody exactly knows why the Samaritans are hated by the Jews from the Bible accounts, but here's the reason. So anyway, let's go back. For more than 600 years, the Jews of Judea and later on those of Galilee also had been at enmity with the Samaritans. This ill feeling between the Jews and the Samaritans came about in this way. About 700 years BC. Boy, so much happened between 700 and 400 years BC. That's when all the great philosophers came out. That's when all kinds of things were happening in the other parts of the world, like the building of large temples and things were happening just in those hundreds of years, back about 600 years before Christ. A lot happened. A lot happened. I keep meaning to ask Syria, hey Siri, when's the next time Nibiru is coming through? And these guys, once we start talking about the Anunnaki, and also when we start talking about Muhammad, they just go, they just zip it up. They zip it up. There's something about that they just don't want to talk about the Anunnaki. They allow me to talk about Enoch, because Enoch's been mentioned several times in the Bible. Anyway, about 700 years BC, Sargon, the king of Assyria, in subduing a revolt in central Palestine, carried away and into captivity over 25,000 Jews of the northern kingdom of Israel, and installed in their place an almost equal number of descendants of the Cuthites and the Sepharvites and the Hamathites. Don't know who they are. Were they, offspring of giants? We don't know. What kind of people were they? Were they Arabs? I don't know, probably. Later on, Ashburnipal sent still other colonies to dwell in Samaria. The religious enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans dated from the return of the former, that would be the Jews, from the Babylonian captivity. So, let me say this again. The religious enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans dated from the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, when the Samaritans worked to prevent the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the temple. So the Samaritans were stopping the Jews from building the temple. Later, they offended the Jews by extending friendly assistance to the armies of Alexander. And that was about 400, 500 BC, Alexander. Such a shame. It's such a shame that they burned down all the libraries of Alexandria. Oh my God, there was so much stuff in there I wish we had. My gosh, they've got the history of the earth and they all got burnt up. It's like when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948. A boy found them he was herding some sheep, taking them through a valley, and he was throwing rocks up into caves, a lot of caves, throwing rocks when he heard something break, like the shattering of a dish. So he knew that there was something up there in that cave. Went up there and he found the Qumran caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're in a couple of great big pots. And so he scooped up all these texts that had sat there for 2,000 years. And you can imagine how brittle they were. Brittle. And took them home. And the mom got mad or whatever and said, what are these, and yeah, maybe we can sell them for antiquity or whatever. But I got to get some fire started for dinner tonight. And she grabs one of the books out of the Dead Sea Scrolls and uses it for kindling for her dinner. Can you imagine? Imagine, what book was that? Which book was that? that was used as kindling for dinner. In Alexandria, we had our entire history of our earth, as far back as there could possibly be any writing. And it got burned up. I can't remember exactly when. It might have been in the ADs, but one of the Roman emperors or whatever, for whatever reason, started a fire in Alexandria, or started fire on boats, on people who opposed the Romans or whatever. Anyway, I think this is what it is. They started a bunch of fires, and the fires on the boats spread to the land. And it ended up burning everything down in Alexandria, including all the great libraries. There, I believe there was one library. It was like a, probably would be like the difference between a 7-Eleven store and a Walmart superstore. The Walmart superstore would be the big library in Alexandria, and the little small library would be equivalent to like a 7-Eleven. And one of those was saved, and so there were things. There are things that we've been able to bring forward. Very little, but some of the Sumerian texts and things like that, but so few. Anyway, in return for their friendship, Alexander gave the Samaritans permission to build a temple on Mount Gerizim. During this life of Jesus, Jesus does go up on Mount Gerizim, as a matter of fact. In fact, I believe we might have covered this already. When Jesus went up on Mount Gerizim, I believe that's when he met up with Lucifer and the devil. But I'll have to confirm that. Don't hold me to that. Anyway, what's his name? What's the king here? The religious enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans dated from the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, when the Samaritans worked to prevent the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But later they offended the Jews by extending friendly assistance to the armies of Alexander. In return for their friendship, Alexander gave the Samaritans permission to build a temple on Mount Gerizim, where they worshipped Yahweh, same God as the Jews. They worship Yahweh and their tribal gods. And they offered sacrifices much after the order of the temple services at Jerusalem. Interesting. Sounds like they weren't doing things much different than what the Jews were doing. At least they continued this worship up to the time of the Maccabees, when John Hyrcanus destroyed their temple on Mount Gerizim. The apostle Philip, in his labors for the Samaritans after the death of Jesus, held many meetings on the site of this old Samaritan temple. That would be up on Mount Gerizim. So let me just read that one part again. It's hard to understand. When John Hyrcanus destroyed their temple on Mount Gerizim, was he the Maccabees? I don't. The Maccabees were Jews. Yeah, John Hyrcanus was a Maccabee, and he destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. And then later on, the Apostle Philip, in his labors for the Samaritans, working with Samaritans, after the death of Jesus, held many meetings on the site of this old Samaritan temple. So the temple was built on Mount Gerizim by the Samaritans. And the Maccabees, led by John Hyrcanus, went up and destroyed that. So the Jews and Samaritans, they get some hard feelings. The antagonisms between the Jews and the Samaritans were time-honored and historic. Increasingly, since the days of Alexander, they had no dealings with each other. They didn't want to have anything to do with each other. The 12 apostles were not averse to preaching in the Greek and other Gentile cities of the Decapolis and Syria, but it was a severe test of their loyalty to the Master when he said, "Let us go into Samaria." All the apostles are Jews. They're strong Jews, believers in the Hebrew and in the Torah and the rules of the Jews. And here Jesus is changing them, saying there's another way. There's a better way. And now he's saying, let's go into Samaria. And they're going like, oh my God, how can we do that? But in the year and more they had been with Jesus, they had developed a form of personal loyalty which transcended even their faith in the teachings and their prejudices against the Samaritans. Now, the woman of Sychar. Many people think... So anyway, that's the story of the Samaritans. Now we're into a chapter here, still in paper 143. The woman of Sychar. Now, if I gave you all a test right now and said, who is the woman of Sychar? You'd all probably scratch your head. And then those who do know about the woman of Sychar, many think it's Mary Magdalene. But it isn't. Jesus meets a lady by the name of Nalda. Nalda. And it's in the New Testament. Part of the New Testament actually, I believe, names Nalda. But Christians nowadays, if you ask them, if the woman that Jesus met at the well and asked for water, who it was, they'll all tell you it was Mary Magdalene, because Jesus knew all about all her husbands and everything. And Mary Magdalene had lots of husbands. I don't know if we would call them husbands. We would probably call them shack-ups. You know, she probably, I don't think she actually got married 6 times, but, you know, she probably lived with 6 different men at one time. Not at the same time, but over different times. Anyway, the woman of Sychar. Let's see what the woman of Sychar is in the Urantia Book. Again, the Urantia Book was channeled in the 1930s. 1930s. Came long after Muhammad. Muhammad said, this book, referring to the Quran, is the forever book, and he is the last prophet. Now, he was the last up until then. But you know what? I mean, other prophets have come along as well. You know, there's a lot of small faiths that have prophets as well. And what about Joseph Smith? Mormons. He said he was a prophet too. And he was the last word of God. I'm watching right down here to see if the little light comes on. I don't think Marissa will come on. So let's keep going with the story of Jesus and the apostles. When the Master and the 12 arrived at Jacob's well, Jesus, being weary from the journey, tarried by the well, while Philip took the apostles with him to assist in bringing food and tents from Sychar, for they were disposed to stay in this vicinity for quite a while. Peter and the Zebedee sons, John and James, would have remained with Jesus, but he requested that they go with their brethren, saying, "Have no fear for me. These Samaritans will be friendly." They're afraid that the Samaritans were actually going to kill Jesus. Certainly do harm to him. We're going to find out Samaritans are not that way. They're probably far more noble than the Jews themselves. So Jesus says, "Have no fear for me." Of course, Jesus knows everything. I mean, he knows he's Michael now. I mean, he's been baptized. The Father has come out and said, "This is my Son, who I am very well pleased." And then he goes up on the mountain for 40 days, and he meets with all his Emmanuel and Gabriel and all the Melchizedeks and all the counselors and all this other stuff. And he does for 40 days, other than meeting with Lucifer for a short time. He's doing universe business. He's taking care of the universe. But the thing is he knows everything. He knows the beginning from the end. He knows he's going to be crucified. He knows he's going to have to put up with that pain, that human pain and agony of being baptized or crucified. But he doesn't seem to be too worried about it. He's like, okay, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. So he knew by leaving James and John and Peter behind. Normally they're always with Jesus. But he left them behind this time because he knew he was going to be meeting with Nalda. And he didn't want the other 3 apostles, who were very strong Jews, to be aghast that Jesus would speak to a woman. I mean, they weren't even supposed to talk to women. I mean, wow. Misogynistic, were they? Wow. If you think Christians were misogynistic, you're going to see that Jesus is not. Jesus says men and women are equal. Doesn't matter what you think. We're all equal. They're not equal in Islam. I can tell you that now. For the longest time, women were just cattle. They're just cattle. You could have as many of them as you wanted. Technically, they said keep it at four wives. How do you keep 4 wives happy? How do you keep the first wife happy after you take a second, or a third, or a fourth? Or in the case of Muhammad, 13. And one of them is under 9 years old. 6 years old. Jesus says, have no fear for me. These Samaritans will be friendly. Only our brethren, the Jews, seek to harm us. See, Jesus should be sticking up for the Jews, and yet he says, it's our own brethren, the Jews, that are going to harm us. And it was almost 6 o'clock on this summer's evening. If it was summertime, the sun doesn't go down till 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, depending on where you are in the Middle East. But technically, I think the summer, if they're on daylight savings time or on standard time, I don't know. I don't think they change their clocks. So let's say it was about 8 o'clock would be sunset. Jesus is out sitting on this well at 6 o'clock. I mean, right down to the hour now. And this is in the month of July, I think, of AD 27. Might be June. And it was almost 6 o'clock on this summer evening when Jesus sat down by the well to await the return of the apostles. The water of Jacob's well was less mineral than that from the wells of Sychar. I'll say that again. The water of Jacob's well was less mineral, probably less salty than that from the wells of Sychar, and was therefore much valued for drinking purposes. That would be Jacob's well. That was the well founded by Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. So it's Jacob's well. So anyway, Jesus was thirsty. That's just an excuse for him to be at the well. I mean, he could have stayed and drank in this camp or whatever, but he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. Jesus was thirsty, but there was no way of getting water from the well. When therefore a woman, so I guess there was no hook with a bucket to bring up water. When therefore a woman of Sychar came up with her water pitcher and prepared to draw from the well. And Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Give me a drink. And this woman of Samaria knew Jesus was a Jew by his appearance and his dress, and she surmised that he was a Galilean Jew from his accent. I think there's still rivalry today between the northern Jews and the southern Jews. The northern Jews is really Israel, and the southern Jews were Judea. And eventually they combined to be the nation of Israel. But there's always been a little bit of hard feelings, probably the same kind of feelings that maybe Michigan and Ohio have against each other because of their football teams and the great battles between Michigan and Ohio State. There was just, some differences between Galilee and Judea. And she surmises that he is a Galilean. He's not Judean. And her name was Nalda. Nalda. Depends on how you pronounce the D. Some people pronounce the D as a TH, and the A as an E, the. So it could be Nalda, but it's spelled Nalda. Her name was Nalda, and she was a comely creature, which means she was a pretty good-looking woman. She was much surprised to have a Jewish man thus speak to her at the well and ask for water, for it was not deemed proper in those days for a self-respecting man to speak to a woman in public, much less for a Jew to converse with a Samaritan. Therefore, Nalda asked Jesus, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan? And even worse, a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for that? And Jesus answered, I have indeed asked you for a drink, but if you could only understand, you would ask me for a draught of the living water. So now they're sitting there going, okay, what's this guy talking about? Is he crazy? And what about living water? Does it talk? And then said Nalda, but sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Whence then have you this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? This is Nalda. And who drank thereof himself and his sons and his cattle as well? That was Nalda, end quote. So Jesus replied, and he said, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whosoever drinks of the water of the living Spirit shall never thirst again. And this living water shall become in him a well of refreshment, springing up even to eternal life. Nah, she couldn't have been thinking, listen, if I drink this water, I'll never be thirsty again. That's taking it quite literally. Tawny said yesterday, she used the word literally. I can't remember, I'm trying to think of the phrase. She said, I literally ate them all. I think that's what she says. I literally ate them all, talking about something, like candies or something. And Drew and I just turned and looked at her like, literally? I mean, this 9-year-old, now 9-year-old, is using a term literally. And she goes, she's Mexican, and the only English she speaks is because of me, and everything else in her life is Spanish. So where do you come up with the word literally? Literally. But would you think literally that drinking of the Spirit means you will never be thirsty again of the mouth? No, that's not what he's talking about. You'll never thirst for righteousness again. Nalda then said, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come all the way hither to draw. In other words, she's thinking, okay, give me this water, and I'll never have to walk all the way back up this hill to this well and draw water. So she's thinking literally. Besides, anything which a Samaritan woman could receive from such a commendable Jew would be a pleasure, is what Nalda says. She says, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come all the way hither to draw. Besides, anything which a Samaritan woman could receive from such a commendable Jew would be a pleasure. Nalda didn't know how to take Jesus' willingness to talk with her. She beheld in the Master's face the countenance of an upright and holy man, but she mistook friendliness for commonplace familiarity, and she misinterpreted his figure of speech as a form of making advances on her. So now she's thinking Jesus is hitting on her. Far from it. And being a woman of lax morals, she was minded openly to become flirtatious when Jesus, looking straight into her eyes with a commanding voice, said, woman, go get your husband and bring him hither. So Jesus tells her, drink this water. It's living water, and it'll bring you the Spirit. And she thinks that he's hitting on her. When sternly he turns to her and says, woman, go get your husband and bring him here. Now this command brought Nalda to her senses. She saw that she had misjudged the Master's kindness. She perceived that she had misconstrued his manner of speech. She was actually frightened. I guess so. I mean, so many things are different. For one thing, there should not be a man sitting there talking to a woman out in the open. Not a Samaritan woman by a Jew, and neither one. Both of them are doing wrong according to each other's customs. But she began to realize that she stood in the presence of an unusual person. And groping about in her mind for a suitable reply, in great confusion, she said, "But sir, I cannot call my husband, for I have no husband." Then Jesus said, and this is where people mistake Nalda for Mary Magdalene. She says, "For I have no husband." Then said Jesus, "You have spoken the truth, for while you may have once had a husband, he with whom you are now living is not your husband. Better it would be if you would cease to trifle with my words and seek for the living water which I have this day offered to you." By this time, Nalda was sobered, and her better self was awakened, and she was not an immoral woman, holy by choice. She wasn't an immoral woman by choice. And I think that's true. A lot of women, they are pushed into being prostitutes at a very early age. You know, maybe 6, 7, 8 as children. You know, and once you've been exposed to that darkness, how do you get out of that darkness? So she's not an immoral woman, holy by choice. She had been ruthlessly and unjustly cast aside by her husband, and in dire straits had consented to live with a certain Greek as his wife, but without marriage. Nalda now felt greatly ashamed that she had so unthinkingly spoken to Jesus, and she most penitently addressed the Master, saying, "My Lord, I repent of my manner of speaking to you, for I perceive that you are a holy man, or maybe even a prophet." Lucky lady, getting to meet Jesus all on her own. If they all had a chance to beam up 2,000 years later to see where we are in the world and what becomes of their status and how we respond to Jesus today. You know, not everybody does. 85% of Christians, according to our channeling with Jesus, 85% of Christians don't understand what they believe. They don't understand Jesus. They don't understand who he was. They don't understand really why the Bible is important. They believe that science has proven that all the books in the Bible are just written by men. They can't be written by God. They can be inspired by God, but they can't be written by God. Nothing. Some people think the only book that may have been written by God might be the book of Hebrews, because nobody seems to know who the real author. They say Paul is, but if you read it, there's stuff in there that talks about Melchizedek's and the life of the Melchizedek's and things that only Abraham knew about Melchizedek's. And did he pass it down through the generations? Only that Melchizedek had shown up and converted him into a believing in being monotheistic, believing in only one God. Because all those Arabs out there, they were believing in lots of gods, because you know what? We all have come to find out that there had been different generations of people on this earth. And at one time there were big giants, but when the giants, before they were all washed away, they were led by kings who were big, and some of them had faces of lions, and some had faces of man, but were on a horse, and I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on long before we in our human form came along. So there was reason to believe in other gods. Go to India today and look at how many gods they worship. They worship so many gods. But, you know, as long as they believe in Brahma is the one and only God in Hindu. Siva is the equivalent of the Holy Spirit, and Krishna, of course, is the example of the sun. So they've got Brahma, Siva, and Krishna in the Hindu faith, and they all seek out the goodness of Brahma and Krishna and Siva. They had the Trinity long before the Jews the Christians had it. And the Jews were really, they weren't good about answering about the trilogy of God. And Muslims believe that there cannot be more than one God. There cannot be a God in three persons. And so they basically discount the entire Hebrew and Christian faith, even though Muhammad says that everyone of the book are brothers. Everyone from the Torah, from the Psalms, from the books of the prophets, and the books of the Scripture, and the books of the Gospels, the books of the Gospels. But they don't even believe in the books of the Gospels. The Gospel, everybody that's in that book, that would be Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And I guess that would take in Samaritans and other forms of offshoot religions. They're all of the book, and they're all to be respected. Everybody's supposed to be respected. We're not supposed to take up arms against our brother. But, in the life and history of humankind, we had the Byzantine Empire, which was run by the Pope and all the Christians, and they were knocking out the Ottoman Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire came back in, and that was Muslims. And so they're fighting each other for hundreds of years, just because none of them were living in the Spirit. Let's put it that way. None of them were living in the Spirit. And Islam does not push the Spirit. It does not advocate for the Spirit, because to advocate for the Spirit would mean that God is more than just one. So anyway, that's what it is. But don't forget, parable of the orchard. Which one's the true fruit? Which one is the one true religion that puts you close to God? Maybe they all do. And as far as in John, where John said, no one goes to the Father except through Christ, well, you can't get out of this universe to go on to meeting God without meeting Michael. You got to meet Christ. You got to meet the owner of this universe before you get out of this universe to go on in your spiritual journey. The first journey you're on is a Urantia journey. And that's, you've got 570 more lives to live in the Urantia life. And there are 7 mansion worlds, 7 dimensions of mansions that we have to go through in our next, after we leave this earth. We've still got a lot to do and a lot of living to do. Okay, did I get off on another tangent? And she was just about to seek direct and personal help from the Master. This is now when she did what so many have done before and since dodged the issue of personal salvation by turning to the discussion of theology and philosophy. And that's what I think of Paul. When I think of Paul, I think of him as a theologian, storyteller, and also philosopher, because he was truly read. He had read all the great philosophers, the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and all the others. I can't think of all the others, but there's about 4 different philosophers in Greek philosophy that Paul had studied. And when he was going out to meet the Gentiles, he couldn't just throw a little wrinkle on the Jews' faith on these Gentiles. Otherwise, they say, "Beat it, get out of here. We don't want to hear about this." But when Paul incorporated in some of the Jewish philosophies, or the Greek philosophies, into his teaching, he was more than the better to bring in the Gentiles. And that's what Jesus wanted him to do, was to go out and round up the Gentiles. And he found that the way to do it was to repeat the stories that he had come to learn through Luke, mostly, but also through Peter and some of the other apostles, And those apostles didn't like Paul very well anyway, because his name was really Saul. And Saul was a Roman guard or countryman who was killing Christians. They'd go up to Damascus and take them, and eventually would take them all the way up to Rome and throw them in the Colosseums and let them get eaten by lions. He was killing Christians. And Jesus stopped him on the road to Damascus one day and said, "Stop it already. Knock it off. I'm real. I'm real. I am very real, and I'm talking to you right now. Do not hurt my children. Do not hurt my children." And from that point on, well, a little bit later, because Paul got blinded, but then 3 days later, the shackles fell from his eyes. And at that point, he became an apostle for Jesus. Anyway, Nalda quickly turned the conversation from her own needs to a theological controversy. Pointing over to Mount Gerizim, she continued, saying, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and yet you would say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Which, then, is the right place to worship God?" Where is the right place to worship God? In the Islamic faith, you need to, one time in your life, take a Hajj. And that means a trip to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and walk around the Kaaba 7 times. Isn't that funny? That's what they did. The Hebrews walked around the walls of Jericho 7 times, blowing their horns when the walls fell. But walking around something 7 times must have some either further deep meaning going back probably well before our recorded past. Anyway, Jesus perceived the attempt of the woman's soul to avoid direct and searching contact with its maker. But he also saw that there was present in her son a desire in her soul. Let me say it. But he also saw that there was present in her soul a desire to know the better way of life. After all, there was in Nalda's heart a true thirst for the living water. Therefore he dealt patiently with her, saying, "Woman, let me say to you that the day is soon coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." Wow, that must have been a shock. He said, "Woman, let me say to you that the day is soon coming when neither on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. But now you worship that which you know not, a mixture of the religion of many pagan gods and Gentile philosophies." This is Jesus speaking to Nalda. "The Jews at least know whom they worship. They have removed all confusion by concentrating their worship upon one God, Yahweh. But you should believe me when I say that the hour will soon come, even now is, when all sincere worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For it is just such worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Your salvation comes not from knowing how others should worship or where, but by receiving into your own heart this living water, which I am offering you even now." Let's see. Let's see how much longer we got to go with Nalda. But Nalda, I think I'll bring you up to date a little bit on Nalda's story. I do not want to go over, and we've just about pushed the hour. So let me just wrap it up. When you're thirsty, drink of the Spirit. Drink of the Spirit. How do you drink of the Spirit? How do we drink of the Spirit? You drink of the Spirit by doing the will of the Father. It's as simple as that. That's what Jesus did. He said, "I only do that which is the will of the Father." How do you know you're doing the will of the Father? Well, first thing you got to do is you got to turn over your will to him and let him take over your life. Because it is he in spirit within you that knows what your plan is. And if you're not following your plan, you're just on a bumpy road. Your life is nothing but one big bumpy road. We've all driven on bumpy roads, and then just as soon as we can turn off that bumpy road, we get on that smooth concrete on the freeway, and it's like glass. It's like smooth. That's what your life is. Once you get into the Spirit and start doing the will of the Father. And that will comes from intuition. You'll feel it. So that's it. I got to wrap it up. Have yourself a really great weekend, everybody. And if God's willing, He'll be bringing me back again on Monday. Don't know if we're going to do that show over the weekend with Marissa, with Gabriel. But we'll let you know, because we're not going to do it live. We're going to tape it and then put it out there a little bit later on. So we'll give you some heads up on that. We'll see what Gabriel says about so-called all of his conversations with Muhammad. Should be a very, very interesting session we're going to have. Very, very. So anyway, God bless all of you. Do the will of the Father and be happy. Stay happy. Keep those endorphins going, and you'll see life's better. All right? Love your neighbor and love God with all your heart and soul. Until next time, I'm Joe Moris. Answers. Heaven Speaks.